This conflict didn't start on 7th October, as horrendous as the events of that day were. This conflict didn't even start on 6th October or 1st October 2023, right? This conflict started way, way back. It didn't even start with the founding of Israel, the State of Israel in 1948. One could very well point towards 1917 as the point in which this thing started, and that is the Balfour Declaration. Right? The Balfour Declaration, which was signed, it was declared on the 2nd of November 1917, where the British government, well, at that time, the time of the empire, and talking about Palestine, which was gonna go to the British because the Ottoman Empire was in decline. It was 7 years before the dissolution, a few years before the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and the British was gonna govern Palestine, and there was a mandate of Palestine. But in 1917, the Balfour Declaration was essentially the British government promising to the Zionist Jews the land that was Palestine. The British promising the Zionists the land that was Palestine. So in the words, and the Palestinians were not at the table. The Palestinians were not consulted. Palestinian statehood was not on the table. So Palestinians were in the land, were in Palestine. There were Palestinians. There was Palestine. And unfortunately, they were not part of this Balfour Declaration. And in the words of George Galloway, right, the Balfour Declaration is essentially this. It was one man on behalf of one people. So one man, and that's Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, one man on behalf of one people, on behalf of the British, promising to another man, Lord Rothschild, on behalf of another people, the Zionist Jews, the land which belonged to a third people, the land which belonged to the Palestinians. And you notice there was no Palestinian representative there. Professor Rashid Khalidi calls the Balfour Declaration the first declaration of war on the Palestinian people. So it was at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and when there was talk about Arab statehood, so all the different nations, there were talk of them being granted the right to self-determination, which is a right under the UN. Right to self-determination means each population can decide the statehood. Right? They are entitled to statehood. So every Arab population was granted that, or almost every Arab population was promised that, except the Palestinians. Now, why was the Balfour Declaration signed? Why did that happen? Well, a few reasons. One is, the most important reason, of course, is strategic, right? It's about protecting British interests and protecting the empire. And of course, Egypt and India were the two of the most important parts of the British Empire, and therefore Britain wanted to protect its interest in Egypt. Of course, Palestine borders Egypt. Another reason that has been given by historians is that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe at that time, even way before the Holocaust. There is a history of anti-Semitism in Europe, and the British, like many other European countries, were happy to have a state for the Jews and send their own Jews there. Right? They wanted to get rid of their Jews, and they were happy to have them move to another place. And that was what happened. Of course, that's not the main reason, but that is a motivating factor for a lot of what happened back then in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. But essentially, it was about protecting the interest of the empire. So from the outset, the Palestinians were excluded from that. Right? And you see that where this was going, right? Once the State of Israel was formed, and the Palestinians were not recognized, even though when they live in that own land, there was always going to be a problem, right? I will return to this slogan later, right? So one of the slogans that the Zionists used when they were campaigning for Palestine to be to be their land, they said a land without people for a people without land. So a land without people. So Palestine, a land which didn't have people for a people without land. So for the Jews, who didn't have a homeland of their own at that point in time. And you can understand the second sentiment, because the Jews were really oppressed and repressed throughout a lot of their history, most of their history, and that's factual, right? But the first part, a land without people. So what were the Palestinians if they were not people, right? So there was already that dehumanization that was taking place from the get-go.